In January 1944, Allied forces in Italy faced a strategic impasse. After months of fighting up the Italian peninsula, the advance toward Rome had stalled against a layered German defensive system anchored on terrain, prepared positions, and interior lines of communication. The Gustav Line, reinforced by geography and deliberate engineering, absorbed Allied pressure while preserving German operational cohesion. Within this context, Allied planners sought a maneuver that could bypass entrenched defenses and alter the operational balance without committing to a prolonged frontal battle. The decision to conduct an amphibious landing at Anzio was rooted in strategic intent rather than tactical necessity. The operation aimed to unhinge German defenses by threatening their rear areas, compelling a withdrawal from prepared positions, and accelerating the capture of Rome. It was conceived as a limited landing supported by naval and air superiority, exploiting Allied control of the sea to impose operational dilemmas on German command. The underlying assumption was that surprise and positional advantage would compensate for limited initial combat power. However, the translation of strategic intent into operational execution introduced constraints that shaped outcomes. Force composition, command relationships, rules governing initiative, and the timing of follow-on operations all influenced how the landing force could be employed once ashore. German responses, informed by experience and enabled by interior lines, further narrowed Allied options. What followed was not a rapid exploitation, but a protracted contest defined by containment, attrition, and delayed maneuver. The Battle of Anzio matters because it illustrates how strategic concepts are mediated by operational realities. The gap between intent and execution was not the product of a single decision, but of interacting assumptions, constraints, and command practices.
Examining this gap provides insight into coalition decision-making, the limits of amphibious maneuver under contested conditions, and the relationship between initiative and control in modern warfare. The origins of the Battle of Anzio lay in the strategic stalemate that defined the Italian campaign by late 1943. Following the Allied landings in southern Italy and the capture of Naples, expectations of rapid advance toward Rome proved unrealistic. German forces, operating under a coherent defensive doctrine, withdrew deliberately into prepared positions that exploited terrain, infrastructure, and interior lines. The resulting operational environment constrained Allied options and forced planners to consider alternatives to continued frontal pressure. Central to this impasse was the German defensive system anchored on the Gustav Line. Stretching across the Italian peninsula, the line integrated natural obstacles, rivers, mountains, and narrow valleys, with fortified positions and pre-registered artillery. German commanders did not view these defenses as static barriers, but as components of a flexible system designed to trade space for time while preserving combat power. This approach reflected a clear operational logic: delay the Allies, impose attrition, and maintain cohesion while strategic priorities were addressed elsewhere. Allied command assessed the situation through a different institutional lens. Political and strategic considerations placed a premium on maintaining momentum in Italy, both to justify the campaign's costs and to prevent German redeployment to other theaters. Rome held symbolic value, but the operational challenge was more concrete. Without a breakthrough, Allied forces risked becoming fixed against successive defensive lines, consuming resources disproportionate to the campaign's strategic return. Within this context, amphibious maneuver emerged as a proposed solution.
The Allies possessed naval superiority in the Mediterranean and experience from earlier landings.
An amphibious operation behind German lines offered the prospect of bypassing prepared defenses, threatening lines of communication, and forcing a German operational withdrawal. This logic was consistent with Allied doctrine emphasizing maneuver enabled by sea control. The specific choice of Anzio reflected a balance between ambition and constraint. The location lay within operational reach of Allied naval forces, and offered access to roads leading toward Rome and the German rear. At the same time, it was close enough to the Gustav Line to create immediate operational pressure. The landing was conceived not as an independent campaign, but as an operation synchronized with renewed ground offensives to the south. However, the feasibility of this concept depended on assumptions that were only partially aligned with operational reality. Allied planners anticipated that German forces would be unable to respond rapidly to a landing so close to the front. This expectation underestimated German capacity for operational mobility and command responsiveness. Interior lines allowed German units to redeploy more quickly than Allied planners assumed, particularly given the constraints on Allied follow-on forces. Force allocation further shaped the operation's character. The landing force was intentionally limited, reflecting shipping constraints and competing priorities across theaters. Planners assumed that speed and surprise would compensate for reduced combat power. This assumption placed a premium on rapid exploitation once ashore, but also introduced risk. If momentum stalled, the landing force would face containment rather than breakout. Command relationships and control measures reflected caution rooted in earlier amphibious experiences. The landing force was placed under strict operational guidance, emphasizing consolidation of the beachhead before advance.
While this approach reduced immediate risk, it constrained initiative at a moment when tempo was critical. The tension between seizing opportunity and avoiding overextension was embedded in the operation from its inception. German awareness of Allied amphibious capability also influenced the preconditions for Anzio. Although the precise location and timing were uncertain, German command anticipated the possibility of a landing in central Italy. Contingency plans emphasized rapid containment rather than immediate counterattack, reflecting a preference for stabilizing the situation before committing forces decisively. This approach aligned with German defensive doctrine and exploited the advantages of interior lines. The strategic intent behind Anzio was therefore clear: alter the operational balance by forcing German withdrawal from prepared defenses. The operational means, however, were constrained by limited force strength, cautious command guidance, and assumptions about enemy reaction. These factors shaped the environment in which decisions would be made once the landing occurred. Understanding these preconditions is essential for evaluating subsequent events. The Battle of Anzio was not defined solely by actions taken after the landing, but by the framework established beforehand. Strategic objectives, doctrinal preferences, and institutional risk tolerance combined to shape an operation that promised high payoff but allowed limited margin for error. This gap between intent and execution did not emerge suddenly. It was the product of accumulated decisions made under pressure, influenced by prior experience and competing priorities. The landing at Anzio represented an attempt to reconcile strategic ambition with operational constraint. Whether that reconciliation was achievable under prevailing conditions would become evident only after forces came ashore. The opening phase of the battle thus reflected a broader pattern in the Italian campaign.
Allied planners sought decisive maneuver to avoid attritional stalemate, while German commanders relied on defense in depth and operational mobility to offset Allied material advantages. Anzio became the point at which these approaches collided. As the landing approached, success depended less on surprise alone than on the ability to translate positional advantage into operational momentum. The extent to which Allied command structures and doctrines enabled or inhibited that translation would determine whether Anzio functioned as a decisive maneuver or a contained lodgment. The events that followed would test not only tactical competence, but the underlying assumptions that had shaped the operation from the outset. The amphibious landing at Anzio on 22 January 1944 marked the transition from strategic planning to operational execution. The assault itself achieved tactical surprise and encountered limited initial resistance, validating key assumptions underlying the operation's design. However, the manner in which success was interpreted and acted upon in the hours and days following the landing revealed the constraints embedded in Allied command doctrine and control philosophy. The landing force, designated 6th Corps and commanded by John P. Lucas, came ashore with minimal opposition. German coastal defenses in the sector were light, reflecting the enemy's focus on the Gustav Line and uncertainty regarding Allied intent. Allied naval and air superiority ensured secure passage and effective suppression of known defensive positions. By the end of the first day, the beachhead was established with comparatively low casualties, and key terrain features were within reach. Despite these favorable conditions, immediate exploitation did not follow. Corps-level orders emphasized consolidation of the beachhead, expansion of defensive positions, and preparation for anticipated German counteraction.
This approach reflected prevailing Allied amphibious doctrine, which prioritized securing lodgements before advancing inland. The doctrine was shaped by lessons from earlier operations, where overextension had led to vulnerability. At Anzio, however, the absence of immediate pressure created an opportunity window the doctrine did not fully accommodate. Lucas interpreted his mission conservatively. His operational guidance stressed caution, emphasizing the limited strength of the landing force and the risk of isolation should German forces respond decisively. Without explicit authorization to conduct a rapid thrust toward the Alban Hills, Lucas prioritized building combat power ashore. Artillery was landed, supply dumps established, and defensive lines organized. These actions enhanced sustainability, but consumed time, during which German command assessed the situation and initiated countermeasures. German response was methodical rather than impulsive. Recognizing the strategic implications of a sustained Allied presence near Rome, German command moved rapidly to contain the beachhead. Forces were redirected from other sectors using interior lines, and command arrangements were adjusted to centralize control of the response. The objective was not immediate destruction of the landing force, but its containment within a manageable perimeter. The speed of the German reaction challenged Allied assumptions. While Allied planners had expected some response, the scale and coordination of German movements exceeded initial estimates. Units arrived at Anzio from multiple directions, establishing blocking positions and constructing defensive works. The opportunity for a rapid Allied advance toward operationally decisive terrain narrowed as German resistance solidified. Allied command at higher levels faced a dilemma. Strategic intent favored aggressive exploitation to force a German withdrawal from the Gustav Line. Operational risk, however, loomed large.
The limited size of the landing force, combined with uncertainty regarding German reserves, reinforced caution. The absence of clear, forceful directives to seize inland objectives reflected this tension between intent and control. Communication between 6th Corps and higher headquarters further influenced outcomes. Orders emphasized maintaining the beachhead and avoiding actions that could jeopardize the force. While not prohibiting advance outright, this guidance lacked the urgency required to compel decisive action. The result was a posture that defaulted to defense, even as opportunities for maneuver remained. As days passed, the operational environment shifted decisively. German containment measures reduced Allied freedom of action, transforming the lodgement into a confined battle space. Attempts to probe outward encountered increasing resistance, and Allied forces began to prepare for sustained defense rather than rapid advance. The beachhead, initially a means to an operational end, became an objective in itself. This phase highlights the practical implications of doctrinal adherence under ambiguous conditions. Allied amphibious doctrine provided a framework for reducing risk, but it did not account for situations in which speed and initiative were decisive. At Anzio, success in landing was not matched by success in exploitation, revealing a gap between strategic aspiration and operational behavior. The decisions made during this period were not the result of incompetence or neglect. They reflected rational assessments within an institutional context that prioritized force preservation. However, these assessments underestimated the operational cost of forfeiting initiative. German forces, once established,
could exploit defensive preparations to impose attrition and delay, neutralizing the intended effects of the landing. By the end of this phase, the nature of the Battle of Anzio had been fundamentally shaped.
What began as an opportunity for maneuver evolved into a contest of containment and endurance. The strategic promise of the operation remained unfulfilled, not because the landing failed, but because the conditions necessary to translate success into operational effect were not exploited in time. Understanding this transition is critical to evaluating Anzio's outcome. The battle's trajectory was set not by the landing itself, but by the decisions that followed. These decisions illustrate how doctrine, command culture, and risk perception interact under operational pressure, shaping outcomes in ways that diverge from strategic intent. As the Anzio beachhead transitioned from initial lodgment to sustained operation, the balance between strategic intent and operational execution shifted decisively in favor of German containment. This phase was defined by the rapid consolidation of German defenses, the erosion of Allied initiative, and the transformation of the battlefield into a static, attritional environment shaped by terrain, firepower, and command decisions. German containment of the beachhead was neither improvised nor purely reactive. Once the scale and location of the landing were confirmed, German command implemented a containment doctrine refined earlier in the Italian campaign. The objective was to seal the perimeter, deny access to decisive terrain, and impose continuous pressure until the landing force could be neutralized or rendered operationally irrelevant. This approach leveraged interior lines, disciplined movement, and centralized coordination. German units arrived in the Anzio area incrementally but coherently. Infantry formations established blocking positions along key axes leading inland, particularly toward the Alban Hills. Artillery was emplaced to dominate likely avenues of advance, while mobile reserves were positioned to counter Allied probes. The emphasis was on depth rather than linear defense, ensuring that any Allied advance would encounter successive layers of resistance. This structure reflected an operational understanding that containment did not require immediate counterattack, only denial of freedom of maneuver. For Allied forces within the beachhead, the operational environment deteriorated rapidly. The narrow perimeter constrained movement and limited options for maneuver. As German artillery concentrations increased, rear areas became exposed to sustained fire, complicating logistics and command activity. The density of forces within a confined space magnified the effects of enemy fires and reduced the effectiveness of Allied numerical and material advantages. Command decisions within the beachhead reflected growing caution. Sixth Corps increasingly oriented its posture toward defense, reinforcing positions and allocating resources to sustainment rather than maneuver. Efforts to break out were limited in scope and lacked the mass required to overcome prepared German positions. These actions, while tactically sound, did not threaten the coherence of German containment. Higher Allied command continued to grapple with competing priorities. The main Allied offensive against the Gustav Line demanded resources and attention, limiting the ability to reinforce Anzio decisively. The landing force remained constrained in size, and the timing of major breakout attempts was linked to progress elsewhere on the front. This interdependence reduced flexibility and delayed decisive action. The terrain around Anzio compounded these difficulties. Flat, open ground favored defensive fires, while limited cover exposed advancing units to observation and artillery. German forces exploited these conditions effectively, integrating fires across the battlefield to disrupt movement and impose attrition. Allied attempts to maneuver encountered predictable challenges, reinforcing defensive tendencies. Air power, though available, could not fully offset these constraints. Weather conditions, enemy dispersion, and the proximity of opposing forces limited the effectiveness of airstrikes. While air support contributed to interdiction and harassment, it did not provide the breakthrough capability required to alter the operational balance within the beachhead. The result was a gradual shift toward attritional engagement. Both sides committed resources to holding and contesting limited ground,
with casualties mounting and operational progress minimal. For the Allies, this represented a divergence from the original purpose of the landing. Anzio had been intended as a maneuver operation designed to force strategic adjustment. Instead, it became a localized battle of endurance. This phase underscores the importance of tempo in operational design. The initial window of opportunity created by the successful landing closed as German containment solidified. Once initiative was lost, regaining it required resources and coordination beyond what the operation had been designed to provide. The structural constraints of the beachhead limited the ability to reintroduce maneuver once static conditions prevailed. Institutionally, the experience highlighted the consequences of ambiguous operational guidance. The absence of clear, time-bound objectives for rapid exploitation allowed caution to dominate decision-making. This was not a failure of individual judgment, but a manifestation of command culture shaped by risk aversion and adherence to doctrine under uncertain conditions. By early February 1944, the Battle of Anzio had assumed its defining character. The landing force remained intact and operational, but strategically constrained. German forces had achieved their immediate objective of containment, neutralizing the operational threat posed by the landing. The strategic intent behind Anzio, forcing a rapid German withdrawal, remained unrealized.
This phase demonstrates how operational outcomes are shaped not only by initial success or failure, but by the interaction between opportunity, doctrine, and command response. At Anzio, the failure to exploit early advantage allowed the enemy to impose a form of battle that negated the operation's original purpose. The implications of this transition would shape subsequent decisions on both sides. For the Allies, the challenge became how to convert a static lodgment into a renewed maneuver opportunity without incurring disproportionate losses. For the Germans, the task was to maintain containment while managing resources under increasing pressure elsewhere. In this sense, Part 3 marks the point at which the Battle of Anzio ceased to be an amphibious maneuver operation and became a prolonged operational contest. The shift was not sudden, but cumulative, driven by decisions made under constraint and shaped by institutional assumptions. Understanding this phase is essential to evaluating why Anzio evolved as it did and why its strategic promise proved so difficult to realize. The transformation of the Anzio lodgment into a static battlefield imposed new operational demands on both sides. As German containment solidified and Allied initiative narrowed, the battle entered a phase defined by sustained pressure, command adaptation, and the management of attrition under constrained conditions. This period tested whether the Allies could reconcile the original strategic purpose of the landing with the operational reality that now prevailed. German operations during this phase focused on maintaining pressure without overcommitting. Containment did not require decisive counterattack. It required denial of Allied maneuver and the steady application of force to impose cost and uncertainty. German command rotated units through the perimeter, adjusted artillery groupings to maintain continuous fires, and conducted limited attacks designed to disrupt Allied preparations. These actions sought to preserve flexibility while exploiting the inherent vulnerabilities of a confined beachhead. For the Allies, the immediate challenge was force preservation under constant threat. German artillery dominated much of the lodgment, complicating logistics and command activity. Supply dumps, headquarters, and assembly areas were subject to regular fire, forcing dispersion and redundancy. The requirement to sustain combat power under these conditions absorbed resources that might otherwise have supported offensive action. Command decisions increasingly reflected the need to manage risk over time. Defensive works were expanded and reinforced, integrating infantry positions, obstacles, and artillery support. The lodgment was organized into sectors with clear responsibilities, improving local control but reinforcing a defensive orientation. While these measures increased survivability, they further entrenched static conditions. Allied efforts to regain initiative took the form of limited offensives aimed at improving tactical positions rather than achieving operational breakthrough. These actions were constrained by the need to coordinate fires, manage limited maneuver space, and avoid exposing flanks.
Although some local gains were achieved, they did not alter the overall balance. German forces absorbed these attacks, adjusted positions, and restored containment. Higher-level Allied planning began to reassess the role of Anzio within the broader campaign. The landing had not produced the anticipated operational disruption, but it continued to fix German forces that might otherwise reinforce other sectors. This containment effect acquired strategic value of its own, even as the original intent remained unfulfilled. The operation's purpose evolved from maneuver to pressure, from breakthrough to fixation. The interaction between Anzio and operations against the Gustav Line became more explicit.
Allied command sought to synchronize renewed offensives to the south with a breakout attempt from the beachhead. This approach acknowledged that Anzio alone lacked the resources to force a decision. Success depended on coordinated pressure across multiple fronts, reducing German capacity to concentrate against any single threat. Institutionally, this phase exposed the difficulty of adapting an operation's purpose once conditions changed. Amphibious doctrine had prepared commanders to establish and defend a lodgment, but provided limited guidance for transitioning from containment back to maneuver. The absence of a clear template increased reliance on ad hoc planning and cautious execution. German command, by contrast, benefited from doctrinal familiarity with defensive containment. Their approach emphasized economy of force and flexible response, enabling sustained pressure without decisive commitment. This asymmetry and doctrinal comfort contributed to the stability of the battlefield despite ongoing combat. Attrition accumulated steadily. Casualties mounted on both sides, and the psychological strain of prolonged exposure to artillery and confined conditions affected operational tempo. For Allied forces, the challenge was to maintain cohesion and readiness while awaiting conditions favorable for renewed action. For German forces, the task was to hold the perimeter with diminishing resources under increasing Allied air and artillery pressure. By the end of this phase, the Battle of Anzio had become a contest defined by endurance rather than maneuver. The strategic narrative surrounding the operation shifted accordingly. What had been conceived as a decisive maneuver now functioned as a supporting operation whose value lay in its ability to constrain enemy options elsewhere. This evolution underscores a central analytical theme. Operations do not retain their original purpose unless conditions allow it.
At Anzio, the failure to secure early momentum forced a redefinition of objectives. Strategic intent did not disappear, but it was mediated by operational constraints that limited feasible courses of action. Understanding, Part 4, is essential to evaluating subsequent decisions. The choices made during this phase, how to allocate resources, when to attempt breakout, and how to integrate Anzio with broader operations, were shaped by the realities of attrition and containment. These realities would determine whether the Allies could eventually convert the lodgment into operational success, or whether Anzio would remain a costly holding action within the larger Italian campaign. By late February and early March 1944, Allied command faced the necessity of redefining success at Anzio. The operation had entered a prolonged phase in which neither side could achieve rapid decision, and the original assumptions underpinning the landing were no longer applicable. This phase was characterized by strategic recalibration, command adjustment, and preparation for a renewed attempt to convert the beachhead into operational leverage. At the Allied strategic level, Anzio was reassessed not as a failed maneuver, but as an immobilized opportunity whose value depended on integration with broader operations. German forces, contained within the Anzio perimeter, represented a fixed commitment of divisions that could not be easily redeployed. This fixation effect gained importance as Allied pressure against the Gustav Line intensified. Anzio's purpose evolved from forcing immediate German withdrawal to contributing indirectly to a cumulative operational solution. This reassessment influenced command decisions within the beachhead. The emphasis shifted from holding ground at minimal cost to preparing for a future breakout under more favorable conditions.
Planning focused on improving force readiness, stockpiling supplies, and refining coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. The objective was to ensure that when a breakout was ordered, it would be supported by sufficient mass and synchronization to overcome German defenses. Command effectiveness became a central concern. The static nature of the battle exposed deficiencies in leadership, coordination, and morale under sustained pressure. Allied High Command concluded that restoring initiative would require not only additional resources, but also changes in command approach. This led to a reassessment of leadership at the corps level and a search for commanders perceived as better suited to aggressive, coordinated operations. German forces, meanwhile, continued to pursue a containment strategy optimized for economy of force. They accepted attrition as the cost of maintaining operational control, calculating that time favored their defensive posture, so long as Allied breakout attempts remained fragmented. German commanders avoided large-scale counteroffensives, recognizing that such actions risked overextension without strategic payoff. Instead, they relied on firepower, terrain, and disciplined defense to sustain the stalemate. The interaction between Anzio and the wider Italian front became increasingly explicit in operational planning. Allied offensives against the Gustav Line were intensified, with the expectation that success there would weaken German containment at Anzio. Conversely, German command sought to balance forces between holding the line south of Rome and maintaining pressure around the beachhead. This interdependence reinforced the importance of coordination and timing. Logistics assumed heightened importance during this phase. The confined nature of the lodgment placed continuous strain on supply systems, requiring careful management to sustain combat effectiveness.
Allied planners worked to expand port capacity, improve internal distribution, and ensure adequate reserves of ammunition and fuel. These efforts aimed to eliminate logistical shortfalls as a limiting factor in future operations. Training and rehearsal within the beachhead reflected lessons learned earlier in the battle. Units practiced coordinated assaults, improved communication procedures, and refined command relationships. Although constrained by enemy fire and limited maneuver space, these preparations contributed to greater cohesion and readiness. The emphasis was on disciplined execution rather than improvisation. Psychological and organizational factors also influenced operational posture. Prolonged exposure to artillery and static conditions eroded morale and initiative, making leadership presence and clarity of purpose increasingly important. Allied command sought to counter this through visible preparation for future action, reinforcing the perception that the beachhead was not an end state, but a staging area. This phase illustrates the complexity of recovering initiative once it has been lost. Operational momentum, once surrendered, cannot be easily regained through intent alone. It requires alignment of resources, command authority, and timing across multiple levels. At Anzio, this alignment proved difficult to achieve under continuous enemy pressure and within the constraints imposed by earlier decisions. By the end of this period, the Battle of Anzio stood at a crossroads. The beachhead was secure but constrained, costly but strategically relevant. The conditions for decisive action were not yet present, but preparations were underway to exploit any opening created elsewhere on the front. The outcome would depend less on events within the lodgment itself than on developments across the broader Italian theater. Part 5 thus represents a phase of transition rather than resolution.
Strategic intent was reformulated to match operational reality, and the operation's success became contingent on synchronization rather than speed. Whether this recalibration would enable Anzio to fulfill a meaningful operational role would be determined in the final stages of the campaign, when the accumulated effects of pressure, attrition, and coordination converged. The decisive phase of the Battle of Anzio was shaped not within the beachhead alone, but by the synchronization of Allied operations across the Italian theater. By April 1944, it had become clear that Anzio could not generate operational decision independently. Its relevance depended on timing, coordination, and the ability to exploit systemic pressure applied elsewhere. This phase,
therefore centers on the integration of Anzio into a broader operational design and the consequences of that integration for execution on the ground. Allied strategic planning converged on a renewed offensive against the Gustav Line, later designated Operation Diadem. The intent was to apply overwhelming pressure along the main front, compel German withdrawal, and create conditions for a breakout from the Anzio beachhead. Unlike earlier attempts, this plan emphasized simultaneity. Success depended on coordinated action that denied German command the ability to shift reserves between sectors. Within the Anzio perimeter, preparations intensified in anticipation of this synchronized effort. Forces were reinforced, artillery concentrations expanded, and logistics stockpiled to sustain high-tempo operations. The emphasis was on mass and coordination rather than rapid maneuver. Lessons from earlier phases informed planning. Breakout would not be attempted without sufficient force to overwhelm prepared defenses and exploit success. German command, facing increasing pressure across the front, confronted a deteriorating operational situation.
While containment at Anzio had been effective, it absorbed forces that were increasingly needed elsewhere. The requirement to defend the Gustav Line, manage attrition, and counter Allied air superiority stretched German resources. Interior lines remained an advantage, but their utility diminished as simultaneous threats multiplied. The initiation of Operation Diadem in May 1944 altered the operational balance. Allied forces achieved progress against the Gustav Line, undermining the coherence of German defenses. As German units were forced to respond, their capacity to maintain containment at Anzio weakened. The conditions long anticipated by Allied planners, reduced enemy concentration and disrupted command cohesion, began to materialize. The breakout from Anzio was executed within this context. Allied forces launched coordinated attacks designed to rupture German defensive belts and regain operational freedom. Artillery and air support were applied in depth, targeting not only frontline positions but also command nodes and movement routes. The objective was to prevent German forces from re-establishing containment once penetration occurred. This phase revealed both the strengths and limitations of Allied execution. Where coordination was effective, German defenses were overcome through weight of fire and sustained pressure. Where timing or communication faltered, resistance stiffened and progress slowed. The breakout was not a rapid exploitation, but a methodical advance constrained by terrain, enemy reaction, and the legacy of earlier containment. Command decisions during this period carried significant consequences. Allied operational intent emphasized linking the breakout with advances from the south, aiming to encircle withdrawing German forces. However, competing priorities influenced execution. The desire to secure Rome, while not formally overriding operational objectives, exerted pressure on decision-making.
The balance between pursuing enemy forces and seizing geographic objectives became a defining tension. German withdrawal from the Anzio sector reflected a calculated response to deteriorating conditions rather than collapse. Forces disengaged in stages, preserving cohesion while yielding ground. This withdrawal demonstrated continued German operational discipline, even as strategic options narrowed. The ability to avoid encirclement underscored the limits of Allied coordination, despite material superiority. For Allied forces, the breakout validated some of the lessons learned earlier in the battle. Concentration of force, improved command integration, and synchronized operations produced tangible results. At the same time, it highlighted persistent challenges. Translating tactical success into decisive operational outcomes required precision in timing and intent that proved difficult under combat conditions. The integration of Anzio into Operation Diadem illustrates the central analytical theme of the battle. Strategic intent alone could not overcome operational constraints. Only when Anzio functioned as part of a coordinated theater-wide effort did its potential become realizable. Even then, outcomes were shaped by choices made under pressure,
and by institutional priorities that competed for attention. This phase also underscores the temporal dimension of operations. Anzio's breakout occurred months after the initial landing, reflecting the cumulative nature of operational opportunity. The delay imposed costs in casualties and resources, but it also allowed for preparation and alignment that had been absent earlier. The operation's ultimate contribution must therefore be evaluated in terms of timing as well as outcome. By the end of this phase, the Battle of Anzio had transitioned from containment to movement. The lodgment, once static and constrained, became a platform for advance. Yet the advance itself revealed the enduring influence of earlier decisions. Opportunities foregone in January could not be fully recovered in May. The operational geometry of the campaign had shifted, but not decisively in Allied favor. Part 6 demonstrates that operational success is rarely binary. The breakout from Anzio achieved important objectives, but it fell short of delivering the decisive encirclement envisioned by planners. The gap between potential and outcome reflects the cumulative effects of doctrine, command culture, and timing. As Allied forces advanced toward Rome, the immediate crisis of Anzio receded. However, the analytical significance of the battle persisted. The events of this phase highlight how operations designed as maneuvers can become prolonged engagements, and how their resolution depends on integration within a larger strategic framework. The final assessment of Anzio would rest not on its breakout alone, but on its contribution to the broader campaign in Italy. The operational outcomes following the breakout from Anzio require evaluation not only in terms of immediate movement, but in how effectively Allied forces converted regained mobility into strategic effect. This phase examines the decisions made during the advance toward Rome, the interaction between operational objectives and institutional priorities, and the consequences of those decisions for the broader Italian campaign. With German containment broken, Allied forces possessed an opportunity to disrupt the withdrawal of German formations retreating northward from the Gustav Line. Operational plans had envisioned a converging movement in which forces advancing from Anzio would cut German lines of retreat while Allied armies from the south maintained pressure. Achieving this outcome required rapid maneuver, precise coordination, and sustained focus on enemy forces rather than terrain objectives. In practice, execution reflected competing priorities.
The capture of Rome carried political and symbolic significance that extended beyond the operational sphere. While not formally defined as the primary military objective, the city's importance influenced decision-making at multiple levels. Command emphasis gradually shifted towards securing Rome, rather than prioritizing encirclement or destruction of withdrawing German forces. This shift had tangible operational consequences. German units, though under pressure, retained sufficient freedom of movement to disengage and withdraw in an organized manner. Allied advances, or successful in gaining ground, did not achieve the tempo required to close escape routes decisively. The opportunity to impose disproportionate losses on German forces diminished, as focus shifted from pursuit to occupation. German command exploited this divergence effectively. Withdrawal plans emphasized delay, rearguard action, and preservation of combat power. Units disengaged incrementally, trading space for time while maintaining cohesion. The ability to execute this withdrawal reflected both operational discipline and the absence of sustained Allied pressure focused on interdiction rather than territorial gain. For Allied forces, the capture of Rome represented a visible success that validated the Italian campaign politically and symbolically. However, from an operational perspective, the outcome was mixed. While the city's capture removed a major geographic objective and simplified logistics, it did not deliver the decisive operational results initially envisioned when Anzio was conceived. Institutionally, this phase highlighted the persistent tension between military logic and broader strategic considerations. The desire to secure visible achievements influenced operational choices
in ways that diluted potential military advantage.
This was not an aberration unique to Anzio, but a recurring feature of coalition warfare in which political, symbolic, and military objectives coexist and compete. The consequences of these decisions extended beyond the immediate aftermath. German forces, having avoided encirclement, withdrew to prepared positions further north, establishing new defensive lines that would require additional Allied operations to overcome. The Italian campaign continued, consuming resources and time that might have been reduced had German forces been decisively disrupted earlier. From an analytical standpoint, Part 7 underscores the importance of clarity in operational priorities. Anzio demonstrated that even when opportunities emerge, their exploitation depends on disciplined focus and alignment of objectives across command levels. The failure to fully capitalize on the breakout was not the result of tactical inability, but of competing institutional imperatives. This phase also reinforces a central theme of the battle. Strategic intent must be protected during execution. At Anzio, intent shifted incrementally under pressure, shaped by considerations external to the battlefield. The resulting outcomes were sufficient, but not optimal. The campaign progressed, but without achieving the level of operational decisiveness that had initially motivated the landing. As Allied forces consolidated control of Rome and continued northward, the Battle of Anzio receded as an active engagement. Its legacy, however, remained embedded in subsequent planning and analysis. The experience informed Allied understanding of how amphibious maneuver, operational exploitation, and strategic priorities interact in practice. Part 7 therefore represents the culmination of Anzio as an operational episode. The landing, containment, breakout, and advance collectively illustrate how an operation can succeed in part while falling short in whole. The distinction between achieving objectives and achieving optimal outcomes is critical to professional military analysis. The final assessment of Anzio must account for both what was accomplished and what remained unrealized. The operation contributed to eventual Allied success in Italy, but at a cost in time, casualties, and missed opportunity. Understanding this balance is essential for evaluating Anzio not as a failure or triumph, but as a complex case of strategic intent constrained by operational execution. The Battle of Anzio concludes not with a decisive operational resolution, but with an assessment of how strategic intent was reshaped by institutional behavior and operational constraint. As an analytical case, Anzio illustrates the limits of maneuver when execution is governed by caution, fragmented priorities, and doctrinal rigidity under uncertainty. Its significance lies in what it reveals about decision-making processes rather than in the terrain gained or forces committed. From conception to conclusion, Anzio was characterized by a persistent gap between what the operation was designed to achieve and what it was structurally able to deliver. Strategically, the landing was intended to impose a dilemma on German command, forcing a withdrawal from prepared defenses and accelerating the collapse of resistance in central Italy. Operationally, the landing force lacked the authority, mass, and doctrinal flexibility required to exploit initial success before the enemy could respond. Once containment was established, the operation's character changed irreversibly. This outcome was not the result of a single flawed decision, but of cumulative institutional choices. Amphibious doctrine emphasized security over exploitation. Command guidance prioritized force preservation in the absence of explicit directives for rapid maneuver. Coalition considerations complicated clarity of intent. Each element was rational in isolation, but together they constrained operational freedom at the decisive moment. German conduct at Anzio further clarifies the analytical balance. German forces did not defeat the landing force, nor did they attempt to do so decisively. Instead, they applied a containment strategy aligned with their broader operational situation. This approach neutralized the threat posed by the landing without incurring unacceptable risk. The effectiveness of this response highlights how operational coherence and doctrinal consistency can offset material disadvantage. Anzio also underscores the role of time in operational effectiveness. The delay between landing and breakout imposed costs that could not be fully recovered. Even when conditions eventually favored Allied movement, the opportunity for decisive disruption had passed. Operational geometry had shifted, but the strategic payoff envisioned in January was no longer attainable in May. Institutionally, the battle reinforced lessons already emerging elsewhere in the war. Initiative must be enabled, not merely permitted. Command structures must align authority with responsibility. Strategic objectives must be protected from erosion during execution. These lessons were not unique to Anzio, but the operation provided a clear demonstration of their consequences when neglected. The legacy of Anzio influenced subsequent Allied planning. Later amphibious and maneuver operations placed greater emphasis on explicit exploitation authority, clearer command intent, and tighter synchronization between landing forces and supporting offensives. These adjustments reflected an understanding that maneuver succeeds not through opportunity alone, but through preparedness to act decisively when opportunity arises. Analytically, Anzio resists simple classification. It was neither a failure in the tactical sense nor a success in the operational sense originally intended.
It achieved sufficient results to contribute to eventual Allied victory in Italy, but it did so inefficiently and at avoidable cost. This ambiguity is central to its instructional value. The battle demonstrates that strategic intent does not guarantee operational outcome. Between the two lies a domain shaped by doctrine, command culture, and institutional risk tolerance. Anzio exposes how friction in this domain can dilute even well-conceived plans. In final assessment, the Battle of Anzio stands as a study in constrained execution. It reveals how an operation designed to accelerate a campaign became a prolonged engagement whose value emerged only indirectly. Its importance lies not in the capture of objectives, but in the clarity it provides regarding the relationship between intent, execution, and consequence in modern warfare. For professional analysis, Anzio serves as a reminder that success is not solely a matter of resources or planning, but of alignment. When strategic ambition, operational authority, and institutional behavior diverge, outcomes will reflect the narrowest of those elements. The Battle of Anzio remains a case where strategic vision exceeded operational reach, and where the cost of that imbalance shaped the campaign that followed.